Hello and welcome to Mark's Woodworking Challenges. I'm Mark, your host, and today we have a hand plane challenge. Or it might be more accurate to say that we perhaps have a solution to a prior hand plane challenge. A couple of years ago, I did a series of videos on British hand planes. One of those was this Scottish Infill smoother. Now, at the time, I was very complimentary of how well this plane took a shaving. Planes like a dream. However, I was not very complimentary about how easy it was to adjust the depth of cut. And the reason for that is this. So there's obviously no depth adjustment on this. All we have is a lever cap tightening and holding the cutter against the wooden infill portion of the plane. So no depth of cut, no lateral adjustment. So it's a little bit like a wooden hand plane in that respect. However, it's not like a wooden hand plane in that it obviously has a tote, and there is no one in their right mind would strike the back of the plane in order to retract the blade. So at the time of the previous video, I posited that basically the only way you could adjust it was to tap the cutter down, hope you ended up at the right spot, and if you went too far, you were probably just going to have to back the cutter out manually and start over again. Because if you did go too far and you were taking a thicker, maybe even a much thicker shaving than you wanted, well, there's just no way to retract the blade 1 micron or so to make it at the right depth, because it's very difficult to do that manually. Your hands just don't have the feel for doing such a small adjustment. So that's how I left it. But recently, a viewer, Chris Dunham, has suggested an alternative approach, and his suggestion is that we hit the bun of the plane in order to retract the blade. You also do this with wooden planes, so that's why the last video was quite topical for this subject. And that's what we're going to try today. Can we adapt that wooden plane methodology to this Scottish infill smoother? So let's try it out. As I said on the previous video, this plane takes a magnificent shaving. Almost effortlessly. It's a joy when it's nice and sharp and adjusted properly. But what we're going to do to test the theory is we're going to tap it down just a hair and take too thick a shaving, so that's a good test. Whew. Whew. All right, well that's that's almost thicker than paper. I mean, that's definitely a thick shaving. That is not what we want to have to try to plane with. So here we go. We are going to tap and see what happens. And it's sort of experimental. Well, already I can tell that is definitely not as thick as the previous one. Let's do one more. Definitely not as hard to push. Still just a tiny bit thick though, so let's try it one more time. Gentle tap. That might have been a little too gentle. That wasn't much different than the previous time. Okay, and then that definitely makes it's still taking a shaving, but it's about as light as you could want. If you were working with difficult wood, this would be right where you'd want the plane. Very nice. Okay, well, frankly, that's all we really need to do. We've gone from taking an overly thick shaving that's where it's extremely difficult to push the plane to wispy fine shavings that are very thin and maybe just what you want if you're working with difficult grain. So we have covered the extremes of plane depth adjustment. Before we wrap it up, I just want to say a few words about technique. It's not clear to me, well, in fact, I would say that I can't see any evidence that anyone has ever retracted the blade by striking the bud. This top surface here is fairly smooth. I obviously was using this hammer to put the blade down, to tap the blade down, because I need something that will get in there on the top of the cutter. However, I want to be perfectly clear about this. Do not whack the bun, especially with a metal hammer. You could see that I was using this mallet and making very gentle taps, and that was sufficient to retract the blade. So be careful out there, because the last thing you want to do is crack this portion of your infill smoother plane. Okay, let's wrap it up. Okay then, what have we learned today? And when I say what have we learned, I mean what have we really learned today? We've learned a couple of things. One is we now have what I would say proven method to gently retract the blade of our Scottish infill smoother. That makes it way easier to use than what I had previously considered. And in fact, because I like this one so much for the way it takes a shaving when it is adjustment, this could actually catapult it into the top tier of my users. Secondly, another thing that I think I personally have learned is sometimes you can get too caught up in the Stanley Bailey universe. So no one would think of tapping on the knob of a Stanley Bailey type plane. And this is just a knob of a different type, so it never occurred to me that you might ever want to tap on it. But I've got to be a little more open-minded in the future. I'm delighted to say that this plane is now what I consider to be fully functional, and I'm sure I will be reaching for it much more in the future. And lastly, a big shout out to Chris Dunham for suggesting this, and that's what I like about this channel. Let's all learn to use our planes together. And so, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and by all means, leave a comment. And so, without further ado, we'll see you next time on Mark's Woodworking Challenges.